Thank you, Walter, for the lovely introduction. I'm gonna share my screen here. So I hope the technology works out and we have a stable connection. So let's see. Okay, I hope you can all see the screen with the PowerPoint. Maybe you cannot, or give me a sign. Okay. So thank you for the lovely introduction. And I want to say that this project is a collaborative project, and my co-author and collaborator, Karin Assmann, is also here today. She's from the University of Georgia. She's working there, and we're working on this together. And I'm going to give you an insight into a project that's still evolving. It's a much larger project, and I just decided to focus on this one aspect of it because it's been something that's been on our mind recently as we worked on a paper for ICA. But I wanted to emphasize that Karin is the second half of this project. I'm just the person kind of presenting what we both have been working on, and she can also jump in later if she's still around and if she wants to add. Our broader question that has been driving our effort has been to think about, let's see, how can I move the slides forward? Oh, here. Has been the larger question of if and how journalism would change if there would be more women journalists in leadership levels of newsrooms. And this was prompted by an initiative in Germany that started in 2012 that was trying to put attention on the fact that there were very few women at the top leadership level in German newsrooms. And so over the past decade, there's been a lot of discourse around that through that initiative, but also through overall societal change in terms of gender roles. And so since we now have that situation, that we have that discourse, that we have slowly some women moving into these leadership ranks, the question that has been around in gender media studies for a long time, if women do journalism differently or if that changes journalism, may have a good time now to kind of put that question up again and have an inquiry into sort of what is playing out in a real world experiment right now, particularly in Germany, where that initiative had put a lot of attention on it. And we are working with different theoretical approaches. I am listing them here. And if you have any questions about that, I can talk about that more later. But I don't want to go into that in detail now. I just want to get ahead and talk a little bit more about what we have been doing. But there are some case studies on that question. And we have been working with the concept of critical mass. We're using standpoint epistemology. And we also have looked into literature in journalism on processes of professionalization, which are often seen to be very strong and overriding other parts of people's identities or ways how to deal with issues in the profession. And then since we're focusing on Germany only, we're also making the case that a national context is kind of important to consider. Alone, when we think about work conditions, we know parental leave, paid parental leave in Germany is very special, very particular. And so that plays a big role also for journalists and their working conditions. And then the argument that we're making in this presentation and the aspect we're talking about today is that also an intersectional intranational context is important. At least in the case of Germany, because we will talk about the fault lines of East German and West German socialization a bit. And that is still a big topic 30 years after 1989, 1990, when a process of reunification has started. There's even contested language around how to call that. I think in English, and the way that the broader world recognizes it is that process of reunification. Although a lot of Germans would argue it's not completed and it didn't happen in just that year. To give you a little bit more on that context, I kind of wanted to focus on the journalists and especially the women journalists. And as you can see on the map, I highlighted what used to be the German Democratic Republic until 1990 in green, and you can see the little Berlin is kind of divided. As we all know, there was a wall there. And then after 1990, it's usually been referred to as East Germany. And in that context, I try to find out some more data about women journalists, but there's not all that much. But I did find out that there were women in leadership in the newsrooms in the GDR also. That number ranges from 4.5% to 30%, depending on what type of news media we're looking at. And we had very early on a woman editor-in-chief of a major newspaper already in 1951. A woman was heading a newspaper in the GDR. And another big piece of context, which you may or may not know, is that women in the GDR, most of them worked full-time. That was just very common. And so did journalists, but they did have a burden of what is often referred to as a second shift, meaning the unpaid care work that they did after they worked full-time. In the 1990s, then in East Germany, that kind of strong self-conception of being equal to men, to working full-time, to having their own income and some sort of economic independence remained among women journalists. But at the same time, in the 90s, we had massive unemployment in East Germany. Also, the number of women journalists decreased. And that kind of went into the early 2000s. So that's kind of the context I was able to pull together. There may be more, but I have to say I had a bit of a hard time finding particular context. So it seems like there's some more need for further research, also historical research. We jump ahead now, just to give you some context that this is still an issue. So the reunification didn't end in 1990. It's just where the process began. I just pulled out some statistics that show up whenever there's a big anniversary, like 20 years after the wall came down, 30 years after the wall came down. And so I looked up some that are particular about gender. And you can see, just like I showed you the map before, that the East German and West German border always shows up in a lot of statistics of how, for instance, income is distributed. And the graphic on the left, where you can see the red and the green, shows income by gender in terms of who earns more. And the green areas show where women earn more than men in comparison, and the red areas where men earn more than women in comparison. And the darker it is, the starker the difference is between the genders. And you can see the only areas that have green fields are in that East German area. At the same time, we don't have as many women living in East Germany as we have in West Germany because of that migration since the 1990s in Germany that just stopped about 2, 3, 4 years ago. And the darker the color, the more men live there, the darker the blue. So you can see there are a lot of areas where we have a ratio where there are way more men living than women in East Germany along that border with West Germany. And the graphic to the right, just a little summary again to show how, for instance, the gender pay gap is much smaller in East Germany between women and men. There are more East German women comparatively who have higher education degrees and who are in top tier leadership. So that kind of history of how they've been socialized into work and income issues, that kind of is the broader context, not specific to journalism, but it's just a broader context that still plays a role, along with many other measures in Germany that is along these East German, West German fault lines more than 30 years after the events of 1989 and 1990. And nevertheless, we know the pipeline in journalism is full in terms of women in Germany. The numbers have gone up to about half of the journalists, depending on the statistics we look at. Sometimes people say, for instance, among freelance journalists, there are more women because maybe also it's a more sort of like precarious area of journalism, but it also ranges when you look at public broadcasters, different ones in different regions. And so, but we know the pipeline is full. So it's not like there's a lack of women journalists in the big journalism pool in Germany. At the same time, that initiative I mentioned before that started in 2012 put together numbers to look at how many women are in leadership positions in newsrooms. And what they first came up with were really dire numbers. They pulled out some leading national media, and you can see a sample here of that. How in 2012, which is the darker color, they barely made up a fifth of the leadership level at these leading news media, which are also all, by the way, placed in West Germany or West German news media. They measured 5 years later again, and in part because of their initiative and in part because of the larger discourse of gender roles in society over the past decade, the numbers went up, and 3 of them went over critical mass, and some were kind of getting close to it. And so there was a big push, a big discourse around that. There are more recent numbers, and I hope it works when I click on this. This is a little, I'm going to scroll this up. This is a little graphic. They are always working with some humor, that initiative, to kind of make it more interesting for people. And so they started a little climbing wall. So you can see this is July 2021. And so you can let the little people climb to see who gets up to now 50%, yay, and you can see the confetti. So it was one news medium that reached the 50% because now it's the discourse has shifted from critical mass to parity. And so we had this one news medium here to the right that reached over 50%, and you can see some are making it, some are going to that critical mass. And so you can do this for all the different years that they have measured. They take measures every half a year for these 9 particular news media. So that's been really helpful and interesting. And Karin and I have have looked at the initiative and what that means for women in leadership. And so we have published one paper from that, but we're still on it, and we're expanding sort of like our question. As we're seeing that women are slowly making their way into the newsroom leadership, we are seeing some dynamics shifting. And in that first part of our study, we talked with over 50 participants, women and men. We didn't have any non-binary participants, even though we tried to reach out. And we did sample among these leading news media that the initiative had initially targeted, and we did supplement with some more broadcasting media because the focus was much more on the print side. And we had one thing that stood out to us in our sample, which is not representative. This is a qualitative study, but it did stand out to us that we had very few women with East German socialization in our sample. And so you can see here we found women in leadership, but they were mostly socialized in West Germany. We also discussed again the question, well, what counts as a leading news medium in Germany when they're all West German owned, when they're located in West Germany, when their history is West German. So maybe we should expand our sample if we're looking for like a more complete discourse, and also people, particularly women in East Germany or with East German socialization. And so what we did is to include more regional news media, because there are no national leading news media that are located in East Germany. But before I get to that, I want to sum up what we found in that first tier as well, just to kind of tick off some of the effects that have been talked about in other industries or in terms of gender for other areas. So we found also there's a class cliff effect in part, there's horizontal segregation, the ideal worker concept is still strong, and there's also dynamics of tokenism. So women are making it into leadership in newsrooms, but all these effects are still playing a role because it's still a pretty recent phenomenon. And as I said, we also found in our sample, which we do think is indicative of the overall landscape, that the women who did benefit so far in these media are of West German socialization background, do not tend to have much children, and do not tend to have a migration background or biography. So we concluded it's not enough to look at just gender and women in particular, but also, well, what else is playing out at that leadership level. As I already hinted at, so we expanded to include regional newspapers because they are a big important way for people to get news in East Germany. East Germans do not tend to read these big national leading news media for many different reasons. And so we expanded and included those. The initiative to put out the push for more women in leadership did also do a study to find out if there are men or women at the head of these regional news media across Germany. And you can see the map that they made on the left. And then we went through the map and then looked at which ones are located in West Germany and East Germany. And so we can see it's predominantly men, again, so that effect is much more exaggerated on the regional level than at the national level. So it's even more men dominated and very few women. And we see in East Germany, which it just means East Germany by location. It doesn't talk about if the people there have a particular socialization. It's just purely by location. We can also see that at that time, there was only one woman editor-in-chief. I think there's now a second one. So these numbers are a couple years old, and it does shift a little bit from time to time. But it's not that suddenly there's like half of them are women. So they're still fairly accurate in terms of the ratio. And so we added regional news media. I looked also for studies that looked at that East German or West German socialization of journalists. And what I did find is one study from 2016 that looked at these regional news media that I just showed you, and focused on the question, who is in leadership in these news media in terms of their socialization? Are these West Germans? Are these East Germans? And they found in 2015, 2016 that these editors-in-chief, 62% were East Germans, and the rest was West German. And that's kind of telling, because in that territory of East Germany, almost 90% of people are of East German socialization. So even within their own territory, they're underrepresented at the leadership level. It's a little more dire at the publisher level. There's even fewer. And at the level of directors for these public broadcasters, it has increased, and that has been shifting also a little bit over the years. The authors of that study did not collect gender data in that study, but they did kind of refer to that quota for women that has been talked a lot about in German discourse. And they wrote that, I translated that, there's an original German quote, if you're interested in getting that. To put it bluntly, although demands for a quota for women in leadership pop up in many places, this happens nowhere for a quota for East Germans in leadership. East Germans are a bigger minority in leadership than women. And immediately in my mind, like my bells start ringing and thinking, East Germans are also women. Women are also East Germans. So there's that intersection that's often not thought about, but the quota for women has been discussed more. And since they have published a study, there has been much more of a discourse also around quotas as a tool for increasing East Germans in leadership roles, which is not just a problem in media and news media, it's also a problem in politics, in the economy, and in other areas broadly. But at the same time, I was thinking, well, you know, women are also part of the East German group. We do have overall the same number of women and men in Germany. It's not like there's a huge skew overall in the population. And then over the past decade, also another discourse has made it much stronger into the German realm, and that's about what we call migration backgrounds or migration biographies. In the US context, we talk a lot about race or ethnicity, but that language is not being used. And so migration background or biography or narrative is what's been referring to in order to think about if people are having a background that is different, perhaps, than having parents, grandparents that have been born and raised in Germany. And so the initiative of the New German Media Makers has been doing fantastic work to look into that. And they also looked at the top news media, and they found that only 6.4% of these top tier editors-in-chiefs had a migration background, and they did intersect with gender, thankfully. And so they found out that, again, this mostly benefited men. There were very few women, just 2 that they could find. And among those that did have a migration background, they found that they were still not really representing the bigger groups that are minoritized people in Germany, but were mostly from other EU countries, but did not represent people from a Polish background or a Turkish background or from Russian-speaking countries, which are also more, on the eastern side for Eastern Europe and play a big role. And so they've done really great work. they have not collected data on East German or West German background, but in their latest study, they do touch on that as an issue and how that could be brought together with also the question of migration backgrounds. And so we can see there is coming together of intersectional thinking in journalism as well as in research on journalism that is going beyond gender and that's looking at these other axes of identification. In the second part of our study, we added these regional news media, as we said, and so we now have a total of 40 news media from which we're pulling interviews or participants. And so far we've talked with 22 individuals who are working for regional news media in our second wave that we started in August 2021. And so this is a work in progress. As I said, we're still going to conduct more interviews to see if we can get women and men from each medium and also at the leading level and non-leading level, so we can get different perspectives. And for this particular aspect, what we're interested in is which are the experiences that women, men, and also non-binary journalists with these different socializations have in their newsrooms, in leadership or non-leadership, and how would that potentially play a role in transforming work culture or work conditions in journalism at the leadership level, as well as in the overall newsroom broadly. Again, we do pay attention to a migration background, but even though it's not reflected in the question, and it is still a challenge to think everything all together all the time. But for this particular part, we try to focus also on the East-West German intersection with gender. So in that sample of the work in progress of the 22 participants we've talked with so far, we had a variety. So in leadership, not in leadership, and we can see we do find East German women in leadership that are of East German socialization, as well as men. But we can also see overall there are more men. So again, this is not representative, but it is an indication. And we saw from the other study that at the regional news media, when you look at the very top level, you barely have any women. So the women that we have here are at lower leadership levels. So if you look at a beat or department heads or regional office heads, something like that, whereas the higher you go, you have more men. So leadership is not doesn't equal leadership. One thing that stood out to me as we made our way through different news media and different areas in the state of Thüringen or Thuringia in English that you can see here on the map in red, we can kind of see that play out quite nicely, I think, how these intersections still work, 30 years after the reunification began. And I've listed it here all in detail. We have 4 regional newspapers in Thüringen. They are both owned by West German media companies, as are all privately owned print and broadcast media in Germany, except the Berliner Zeitung, so one newspaper in Berlin. And among these 4 regional newspapers, we have overall at the very top leadership level 6 men and 1 woman. And among these 7, we have 4 who are socialized in West Germany, so still more West Germans, and 3 who were socialized in East Germany. But when we square that together, there are no East German women. The 1 woman happens to be one who was socialized in West Germany and came very early after the wall came down into East Germany to build up a newspaper, be part of that new scene. And so far, even 30 years after the reunification began, still no East German woman has made it at the head of one of these newspapers. So this is just a little capsule to give you a little bit of a case study, because it was something that kind of came together well as we talked with people. So some of the ad hoc conclusions I'd like to offer now about the regional news media so far is that when we look at leadership levels, we can see there is still a continued dominance of West German men in these regional news media at the top level. And one of our participants kind of said the higher you go, the more West German, the more men you'll find. But we do see also East German men in leadership, and the narratives around that is often an emphasis that they are homegrown or that they're returning home. So it's made sort of like a big deal that they are actually East German in East Germany at these newspapers, because the norm used to be that there are so many West Germans in that leadership level. So now they're using that as a narrative and as a special standout feature. For the East German women, like I said, they tend to be at these lower leadership levels. And that's because they are very qualified, but also we are hearing sometimes that it's also good for optics, that it is playing into the spirit of the time to show that there are women and to promote them and support them. And it seems like there are younger women who are benefiting from that more than older women journalists. We are seeing also the horizontal segregation that we've seen in the other part of the study as well, meaning that at any tier, there seem to be tendencies that when there's a particular department or beat that is maybe a little bit less valued overall, that tends to be more led by women versus the beats that are highly valued, like politics, investigative reporting, or also sports, still tend to be much more dominated by men in leadership at that level. Here are a couple of quotes that I pulled from our interviews. The first one speaks to that overall norm that has been set in East Germany, that the people who get ahead are West Germans. There's no way around that. All the corporate headquarters are in West Germany, and it's not uncommon that they send people in leadership from there to us. And so in contrast then is that narrative that stands out to say it made a good story for our readers that there's an East German man after all the West Germans in that position. And the third quote speaks to that other dynamic that we've been hearing about also in the first part of our study. And this person said that among the circle of veteran men colleagues, we have the verdict that the editor-in-chief likes to adorn himself with young women at his side at the beat level. It makes a good impression. And one of my women colleagues, who's talented, no question about that, benefited from that. So there is a dynamic that there are women in leadership, but you still have to ask where are they at and who are they? Another theme that has popped up is still the continuous question of care work. Who is doing the care work, and are women journalists impacted still by a sort of like a disproportionate burden? And that's what we're still seeing reflected back to us, that women journalists still have sort of like that second shift. They're still much more burdened with care work, more than men journalists. And that came out also in questions about the pandemic. We're not presenting any specific results about the pandemic, but we did ask in that new wave, how did work change during the pandemic for you? Another issue that came up is that it seems to be more common for women journalists who work in East Germany to have children and work full time. And that was kind of linked with the physical and socio-cultural advantages that the GDR and then East Germany still holds for care work. And one editor-in-chief was talking about that, and he was socialized in West Germany, and he said it's still much more understood for working women in East Germany to have children, and that's due to the difference in childcare facilities, which are at a higher level in East Germany, making it easier for women to work. In our newsroom, we have women journalists who have 3 school children and who work full time. That would have been unthinkable in West Germany, that a woman would have done that. So there is a difference in that care work in terms of how it's framed, that it's okay for women to be a mother and a full-time working journalist, but also the physical infrastructure is advantageous. At the same time, we do have the double burden, and another journalist in leadership, a man, said that he could observe that in his newsroom, saying that the burden in the family is still much more so that the children want to spend time with the mother rather than the father. And so he observed that it had more of an impact during the pandemic on his women journalist colleagues. And last, we can see in terms of diversity that barely any journalist that we talked with had a migration background or history. And when we asked them, do you have colleagues in the newsroom? There was also not a lot there. So there's still a lack of journalists with migration biographies in these newsrooms to bring that kind of perspective. We also explicitly ask about journalists and colleagues who are identifying as non-binary or agender, and there were barely anyone there they said that doesn't exist. And then they often quickly linked it to the issue of sexual orientation, which is kind of different, but was seen as also very private, kind of like a private thing to ask. So they thought maybe people don't make that known. But there are other questions around there where the journalist pool is quite homogeneous. So when we look beyond gender, there's some other work, but there's also a lot of people who are not represented. So I want to close with that, and just a last little conclusion to say that intersectional lens that uses an analysis of gender, but beyond gender, also of East German and West German socialization, and also migration biography, is much more needed to understand how leadership in journalism could potentially change or not, depending on who's there and who could bring their perspective, and in turn could potentially change work conditions and culture. May not be the case. We still don't have a lot of critical mass or parity as we saw to even see if that makes a big impact, but just looking at who is there and how would they envision work culture and work conditions. So we're still at the beginning of that work, and there's still a beginning discourse in newsrooms about that, and we also need more research on that. And I want to close with one favorite quote by Audre Lorde that speaks to that intersectionality, which is kind of hard to work on that and think along all these things all the time, but she famously said there is no single issue struggle because we don't lead single issue lives. And so I think that also pertains to journalism. And thank you for your patience and attention, and I'm happy to take your questions.